This is Lenny Cooper, and I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, on the eve of the 2007 Space Small Press Alternative Comics Exposition. And joining me tonight is Mr. Dave Sim, creator of Cerebus, Jeffrey Tundis, one of the Cerebus Yahoo group moderators, of which I am also a moderator. Off camera, we have, or maybe we're on camera, is Margaret Lith, also a moderator, and all over the room are tons of Yahoos. Sweep across.
We're up to our eyeballs in Yahoos here, folks. Everybody call out your name all at once.
Nobody has a name.
Pointlessly. I mean, it's
Everybody give a big Yahoo.
Yahoo! Trademark. No. Anyway,
I'm glad my room's on the other side of the hotel.
Yes.
One of the highlights of Space every year is the award of the Day Prize, given by Dave Sim himself. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about what the Day Prize is?
Yeah, that's the Howard E. Day Memorial Prize, named after a guy who was my mentor in the comic book field, Gene Day, Howard Eugene Day. Actually, I found out years later on his name was Howard Gene Day, because his mother hated the name Eugene. But he went by Howard Eugene Day because it sounded like Robert E. Howard. So, we've been handing out the Day Prize. It's a festival prize here at Space for the comic book or graphic novel or mini comic that's judged the best of the show the previous year, and everybody gets to submit at least one comic book that they want to have judged for the Day Prize. And up until Gerhardt left the company at the end of December, one year he picked the short list and I picked the recipient. And then the next year, he'd be the one to pick the recipient, and I'd do the short list. I suspect part of the reason he left the company this year because it was his turn to read 150 comic books and narrow them down to 5. It's quite a task.
What prompted you to start the Day Prize in the first place?
Don't remember. No, it was partly a way of honoring Gene's memory, because he was certainly a very important part of my life with the self-publishing and independent comics that he did. He certainly didn't do it as much as he worked for Marvel Comics, but that was where he was very influential for me. And then there's also I remember getting the Ed April Award in 1979 at the New York Comic Book Convention that Phil Suling used to put on, and that was just selected by Phil. That was honoring Ed April, who was the publisher of Comic Art Showcase, and who had died recently. And it wasn't really a whole Academy voting. Again, it was just Phil Suling saying, I think Ed would have been happy knowing that Dave Sim got this award for Cerebus, gave another one to Richard and Wendy Peeney for ElfQuest, and it sure keeps you going. I mean, that was 2 years into Cerebus, where I was still at the point where I could have made more money cutting lawns or babysitting, and just to have a plaque on the wall that you can look over and go, well, somebody thought I deserved a plaque. So that's a lot the same sort of spirit. Is some of these guys are going to go on to a long career in comics. Some of them, this will be the high watermark, but at least they got the Day Prize once.
Could you tell us some of the comics that Gene Day did? You mentioned that he worked in the alternative comics.
Oh yeah, he was always planning comics. He did a digest-sized comic called Out of the Depths, which I contributed to, but he was always talking about doing another anthology called Hellhound, which he never actually got finished.
What time frame are we talking here?
Late 1930s. No, it's just seems like the late 1930s now. I'm getting old. This would have been 1974, 75, and then he started working for Marvel Comics about 76, I think, and that became very, very time-consuming. So, Dark Fantasy, the fantasy and science fiction magazine that he published, that was text and illustrations.
Now, that was also Dan Day was a lot of work in that. Now, was that their relation there?
Yeah. Dan was his younger brother, and then David Day came along. He was even a younger brother than that, and the Day family were all very productive. Before Gene even put out the first issue of Dark Fantasy, he used to do his own fantasy and science fiction digest magazines. He would get home from work and produce a magazine from the time he got off work until the time he went to bed, writing short stories, putting illustrations in it, doing a cover, and then coloring the cover with pencil crayon. And he literally had this whole bookshelf full of these fantasy and science fiction magazines, one of a kind, each of them, that he did before he even finally tried to do Dark Fantasy. So that's the do-it-yourself instinct at a very high level, and that's the sort of thing that I like to applaud.
I know I first encountered Gene Day. He was doing Master of Kung Fu, and it just blew me away when that first came out. His sense of design, his sense of page design was really stunning to me. And I hadn't heard of his earlier work, but that's what really made me a big fan of his work from the beginning.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was an amazing thing to see the transition, because he was inking Master of Kung Fu over Mike Zeck.
Sure.
And then Mike left because he got the offer to do Captain America, which was a higher profile book in the Marvel pecking order and more likely to produce royalties, hit the royalty threshold. Master of Kung Fu was always just on the verge of cancellation. As a result, they couldn't get anybody to take over Master of Kung Fu. Gene's sitting there waiting to ink the next issue, and nobody's willing to pencil it. So they kept pushing him. Would you take it over? Like do the whole 9 yards? And Gene was definitely not as fast a penciler as he was an inker. That was Dan. That was when he and Dan started working more extensively together of photo reference. Like they'd have the giant train coming to you on the the top of the page, and there's Dan out finding a picture of a train head on and tracing that off onto the tracing paper, and then sort of taping it into place. This is going to be on page 5, and we're going to take up as much of page 5 with the train as we can. And then Gene's got a few little leaping figures down here because he's going to be jumping off of the train. And of course, it's done Marvel style. It's Doug Mensch gave him an outline over the phone. He was the writer, and then it's up to you to pencil and lay out all of these pages, and hopefully tell an interesting story that when the writer gets the penciled pages, he says, well, this is interesting. I know how to write this. I think you can vouch for the fact that Doug Mensch and Gene Day together was a pretty potent combination.
Absolutely. And in fact, in light of his earlier independent alternative work, it seems that Master of Kung Fu, even though it was with the big company Marvel, would fit right in terms of spirit. It certainly, to me at least, has an independent kind of a feel to it.
Yeah, it was a little too independent as far as Jim Shooter was concerned, unfortunately.
He even managed to sneak a Cerebus in there one time.
He was, like Gene was doing innovative layouts and doing sequential pages where you'd have a continuous background and then the action taking place in the foreground. And Jim Shooter was definitely old school. The 6 panels to a page, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think Shooter was probably right. Jim Shooter's books sold well. Business-wise, is what Marvel was doing.
Sure,
they weren't in the business of doing really esoteric, artsy comics. The idea was to sell as many copies as you could, but it was definitely becoming a fan favorite. There was more people buying Master of Kung Fu in the same way that happened shortly thereafter with Swamp Thing. Any other title like that, all of a sudden a new team takes over, and word starts getting out. Hey, check this out. There's some interesting things being done here.
Perhaps being a little more creator-driven than character-driven.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because I think because Doug Mensch had been on the title right from the beginning, he had worked with Paul Gulacy.
Yeah.
So he knew the characters inside and out. There was a certain adjustment because you have a new penciler inker on the book. Gene Day's Kung Fu was not Paul Gulacy's Kung Fu, or Mensch and Gulacy's Kung Fu. So I think there was probably latitude there to, let's see where this goes. I think Jim Shooter could have let everybody a little bit more off of the leash than he did, just in the sense that, hey, this is a book you were ready to cancel, and now the sales are going up. Gene always said he was a huge Pink Floyd fan, and he said, it's have a cigar time. It can all be a monster if we all pull together as a team. It's like nobody said anything about just get the pages in on time, but now everybody's talking about it and sales are going up. So you've got editors and assistant editors who all have to jump onto it and put their imprint on it to say, yeah, we all pulled together as a team and turned Kung Fu into this major hit.
Well, there's also the aspect that, the commercial aspect, that whatever they've done up to that point created a sales increase. And at some point, the marketing people are going to go, okay, well, whatever's working, whatever they're doing now is working.
Right.
So let's not go too far as to alienate people. Let's keep with whatever the formula is now that's selling books. So, there's also a lot of marketing. Like you said, it's Marvel. It's a commercial house. It's not an art house. It's a commercial house. It's a machine. So, when you put yourself in that situation, there's really, that's all that. It's the only outcome.
Well, yeah, and then it got really intricate with things like with the continuous backgrounds. Jim Shooter considered that unreadable, but because it's got this background going across all of these panels and it's the same background, the kids are going to find that confusing. And Jim Shooter's taking it down the hall and showing it to Archie Goodwin and saying, "Can you read this?" It's like, it's Archie's boss, so you're reading it, and he goes, "Well, yeah, it's not textbook 6 panels to a page, but yeah, I find it readable." So then Shooter's trying to figure out a way to get around this. That so his suggestion was to tell the colorist to do the backgrounds different colors. So you'd have this weird continuous background where the steps are like blue in this panel, and then they turn red, and then they turn purple.
Pseudo-Steranko.
And this was Shooter's way of saying, well, this will make it easier to read because you can at least tell that they're different panels. So you read all of this panel, and then you read all of this panel. And then Jim Shooter, the colorist that he got to do it was his girlfriend, Christy Shield. And then, of course, Gene makes the mistake of going, well, if the colorist hadn't screwed it up.
It's a basic case of everybody not wanting to buck the system and pass the buck at the same time.
And pass the buck, and everybody's, it really, it does happen that as soon as you have even a minor success, everybody wants to get in there and take a look at it. And obviously, Shooter's attitude was, well, it's selling really good now. If we actually make it readable, it's going to sell that much more. And for most people, it was readable.
I want to ask you another question about the dark fantasy era. Now that was, what was that? Was that Renegade Press at the time?
Dark fantasy?
Yeah, was that?
No. That was Dark fantasy was Shadow Press. Yeah.
Now, wasn't that what eventually kind of got the whole gang together in those early days? That was kind of instrumental to.
Oh, definitely. It was a whole coalition gathered around Gene Day.
And bring it back into the relevance of his involvement in the, the creation of not only Cerebus but your career as well. He was in that initial formative group of people that led to.
It sounds like the time frame you had mentioned, 1975. That's shortly before you embarked on your 26-year journey of creating Cerebus. Is there a relationship between that and your starting on Cerebus and creating it?
Yeah, I mean, there was the different things happening. There was at the same time that I was going through that, I was also Gene and I were also doing the Oktoberfest comic for Harry Kremer at Now and Then Books. So that was a matter of, I found out you can produce a black and white comic book on newsprint with color covers, 5,000 copies for X number of dollars. Suddenly it's very much within range, whereas before that there was always this mystique attached to publishing, which I think most artists and writers have. I have to go and find a publisher because they know all of these things that I don't know, and having actually put a comic book together, it's almost all comics. I mean, if you just do comics all the way through, if you've drawn 24 pages of comics, there's not a whole lot left over to do after that. So between that and working for small press places, doing 8-page stories and whatnot, and they just never seem to get anything out. There's a lot of sitting around talking about getting the first issue out, and then they sit around talking for another year before the second issue came out. It's like, why don't you just sit down and write and draw comics? And all you have to do is take it to the printer, and pay the printer this much, and find enough people to sell it to. Then you take the amount of money that comes in, and put that money towards putting the next one out. Keep it consistent. Keep the logo the same. Do a continuing character. Put a letters page in the back. This isn't rocket science.
They're worrying about step 10, and they haven't even completed step 1 through 9 yet.
Yeah, and it was usually guys publishing. So a lot of their fun came out of making it more complicated. Let's be Marvel and DC. You'll write this story, and then we'll give this script to this guy, and he'll pencil it, and then he sends it to this guy, and he'll letter it, and then it goes to this guy over here, and he'll ink it. And all of these people have full-time jobs. I mean, you see what's going to happen. You do see what's going to happen.
I sure do, Dan. I sure do.
And you almost kind of fell into that trap, too. Then when you were doing the comic graphics thing, and you created like 5 or 6 different superhero fantasy stories all in like this cohesive universe, the Blue Dynamo and all that group, you were kind of headed down the same road of, let's make these 5 different concurrent stories, and then we'll farm them out.
This is pre-Cerebus.
Yeah. Well, that was against getting somebody else to pay for it. Was a guy saying, "I'll publish a comic book if you'll draw it," and then sitting and starting 4 different comic series that would all appear in a 32-page comic book, and then the next issue would have installments of each of them again. Did I really want to do this? It's all taking place in the same world, but I got to keep track of all of these guys. I got to remember what the first mate's name is, and I can't even stand to do that with television shows that I'm watching. How am I going to do this for a living?
Peter Parker, Reed Richards, Susan Storm.
Right.
Well, you just hire Mark Grunwald.
Unfortunately, those were all used, and there were legal troubles there.
So that explains sort of your evolution towards your realization that you could create a comic. But let me take a step back. Why create a comic?
You're right against the wall. I don't think you can take a seat. Why create a comic?
Yeah. Why make a comic book? What does it mean to you? Why did you decide that you wanted to create comic books? Not only, let alone create them at all, but create them for your career, basically.
I don't know. What was I thinking of? That's crazy. Doing a comic book. No, it was comic books were. There was nothing better for me. From a very early age, I remember Ken Viola, one of the Cerebus readers, who was also roadieing for the Rolling Stones, said that Keith Richards said to him once that when he first heard American Rhythm and Blues, that turned his black and white world to color. And that's a good way of putting it. It's like, yeah, there's things that you find that you like, there are things that you enjoy, that you have a certain affection for, and then there's others that just change everything. And comic books were definitely that for me. Comics in general, but comic books specifically, if there was a chance to do it, that was certainly what I wanted to do. That was even to this day, it's like, would you rather write and draw a comic book or direct a movie? I'd rather write and draw a comic book. I'd rather get paid like you do for directing a movie, but I'd rather do the comic book. It's my medium. It's how I see things. I don't see it as a raw material for movies or something like that.
Well, the comics medium seems to have strengths of its own. I don't know if you were thinking about that way back at the very beginning, but it's sort of a hybrid medium, combining prose, literature, and movies. And how do you see the strengths of comic books in general in terms of telling a story?
Almost unlimited. When I was writing fanzines, which is a little before that time period, 1971, 72, I did a series called Shapers of the Medium, something like that, and talked about Will Eisner and talked about Jim Steranko, the guys who first did these things, first said, you don't have to do a comic book that way. These aren't carved in stone rules. You can do narrower panels. And not only that, if you do a narrow panel, it makes the story go faster. If you do 5 narrow panels in a row, people read that faster than they read a square panel. So I was already dealing with the theory behind it, the theory behind comic books, and realizing, it's lunch bucket, 6 panels to a page, but then guys come along and say, okay, what if you do this? What does this do to the page if you use narrower panels, if you use taller panels, if you drop out the backgrounds, if you do sound effects this way? So it seemed natural that I would come to a point where I was giving myself my own playground. I want to do that. I want to sit down and not try to figure out what's the editor going to think of this. I had done a certain amount of freelancing, and I realized that's how you've got to do it, but it's really not very good for creativity if you sit down and go, what do I think this editor will buy? And instead saying, what do I think is the best way to tell this story?
Sure. So that explains why a comic. Now to get to a classic question, I ask why an aardvark? Why a comic book?
You can ask it, but that's I don't answer that.
Well, not necessarily an aardvark, but Cerebus in general. Why did you create Cerebus?
Cerebus the iguana just didn't have the same ring to it.
I think Lenny and I had discussed this kind of question earlier. I think what he's getting at is, was it even important to be an aardvark? Because it seems like the story would be just as valid, just as entertaining, just as important if the character were not an aardvark. It could be a human with some kind of physical defect that set him apart. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like you started off, doing the Conan parody, and at a certain point, even you realized maybe within the context of the story that aspect of it really wasn't important. But
the funny animal.
But by then you were already trapped in that mold. You weren't going to start over again because you had an audience.
Well, it's also, you have to remember the time period that the hottest thing going at the time was Howard the Duck. Mike Friedrich was doing, Star Reach Publisher was doing a title called Quack and soliciting funny animal works, and this was his attempt to capitalize on the Howard the Duck success. And
you gave that a stab with the beavers.
Yeah, and that was one of those moments looking at it and saying, he was looking for new ideas for Quack because the title wasn't selling very well, and it was like, well, okay, what's wrong here? I mean, this is a funny animal book, and he's got funny animal stories by Howard Chaykin and Steve Leialoha and Scott Shaw, Michael T. Gilbert. Like, they're all good guys, good innovative artists, but it's just not translating. And that was the first time that I thought, well, okay, I think what they're missing is that Howard the Duck was a funny animal in the world of humans. And comics do that probably better than any other medium. It's the only environment where you could do Daffy Duck interacting with a human being. You can do Jerry from Tom and Jerry dancing with Gene Kelly, but you never really believe, Jerry is up there dancing with Gene Kelly. And if you do believe that, it's like you have more serious problems than...
You could do a Howard the Duck movie too, but...
Yeah. Well, yes, and people have.
Yes,
once.
Unfortunately. You discussed a lot of that in following Cerebus, the pinnacle, the key point that you reached where you realized that it had to be a funny animal in a world of humans. That was the key.
Right.
What I'm saying is, in retrospect...
But that's important. Like, I understand what you're saying, like, later on...
Right, it's important at the foundation of Cerebus.
No, I think it's important as you go along, because it's you have to have something structurally that appeals to comic book fans, as comic book fans per se. If you go too esoteric, where you don't have something in there that is pure comic books, which I think a cartoon and a human being, dating all the way back to Siegel and Schuster's Slam Bradley and Shorty in the first issue of Detective Comics, one of the first all-new comic books, it was pretty clear that they were doing the Slam Bradley characters in their realism style, in Schuster's realism style, but Shorty was definitely drawn as a cartoon character. I think that's part of comic book genetics, that this, you respond positively to it as a comic book fan, the same way as superheroes only work in the comic book medium really, really effectively, and you get readers to respond to it. So consequently, I could do more I could go into a political storyline, I could go into a religious storyline, I could do things that were, about more sophisticated subjects, but I still had this overall template. I still had something that, whether the comic book fan was aware of it or not when they saw it, they just respond to a cartoon character interacting with a more realistically drawn character.
It's kind of an iconic touchstone for the story itself. Because even by Melmoth and Reeds, it becomes almost a non-issue. Like, why even bother with Cerebus? Because the writing is so strong by that point, the story works on its own no matter if Cerebus is there or not.
Could I have gotten there?
Right, well that's what I'm saying. Not looking at the beginning of Cerebus or even through High Society, where there was still that farcical aspect that a large part of the comedy was the fact that it was a 3-foot tall talking aardvark, and it was ridiculous.
Right.
By the time you got to obviously Jocka's story, it wasn't necessary, and as you got beyond that, Minds. I mean, the writing in Minds, the subject matter in Minds, is so strong and so entertaining by itself that just the idea of the aardvark itself almost becomes inconsequential, which I guess is
to a degree. But he's also, then you just start applying a more adult sensibility to that, of going, okay, what would it be like to be the only one of your kind, trapped in a world he never made, which is the tagline for Howard the Duck. But what is that like? What would that do to you as a personality? So consequently, because I've still got the facade, the basic, there's no question about it. This is a cartoon character. This is a real person. This is a cartoon character. This is a real person. But I'm also starting to deal with the cartoon character as a real person, where I'm starting to develop this whole personality that I've been living with as, okay, why does he behave that way? How does he respond? How much of this comes from being just so alienated from everybody else? The fact that this exceptional nature isn't that, he's got 3 ears, one in the middle of his forehead, or something like that, which I could have tried as well. But, then you're just getting esoteric. Then you...
Well, it's an esoteric question.
Yeah. It's an esoteric answer. It's an esoteric Mountain Dew.
Well, do you ever think in some ways that having the Aardvark, the funny animal character, throughout the book covers a lot of complex and serious themes. Do you think, in terms of the general public, that might make it a little harder for them to accept it? To accept that a comic book or a piece of work that has a funny animal in it actually could tackle the big issues in life? And in any way, do you think that worked against the comic?
Yeah, I mean, it's always got elements working against it, and it's got elements working in its favor. But it's a lot like coming to the end of a war, and, if you didn't get killed in battle and somebody else did, why did he die and somebody else didn't? I can go through chapter and verse, all of these comic books that I liked, that people would send me in the mail, and, it lasted 7 issues, lasted 10 issues, and I thought, the guy draws better than I do, he tells a story better than I do, I think it's more engaging, the individual episodes just didn't fly. So, okay. But you sit there and you don't get any definitive answers. I can't say Cerebus actually survived the 26 years because I can speculate that, if you, being the only person who said, I'm going to do 300 issues, and everybody thought I was crazy, and they laughed at me.
Who's laughing?
That's right.
I think that says a lot as to why.
Remember, they laughed at Charlie Chaplin, too. Well, that's right, they were supposed to laugh at Charlie Chaplin. He was doing funny things.
So, Dave, yes.
Okay. All right, bad example.
I think that says a lot about why Cerebus succeeded when others didn't. I think you sell yourself a little short, not to delve into the sycophantic. But what you were tackling in there, you approach storylines with a lot more levels, with a lot more maturity in dialogue and adult situations, and stuff that, no matter how much you might have liked somebody's book, nobody was really doing what you were doing, especially once you started getting rolling through high society. No one was telling stories on the level you were, and especially not doing it consistently, and you just kept getting better and better and better at it. And I think
depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to Peter David or somebody else like that who loved the first dozen or 2 dozen issues, it's like it wasn't better and better. It was like too esoteric.
Yeah, so we discussed a lot of that with Peter David. What was it, the line he used? He writes to the bit all the time.
He what?
He's like a comedy writer. He writes
That's
to the bit.
actually what John Burns says.
At the expense of the material.
And to a sense, it's that true, because he'll get the punchline and then he'll just write to the punchline.
But that's guesswork too. To say, okay, what is it that I'm doing here? I mean, I definitely felt an obligation to live up to this situation that I was in. First guy having this chance to do the story exactly the way I wanted to do it, and I was always having to balance in my mind, okay, what is the obligation? Like in one sense, it's do the most crowd-pleasing book you possibly can. I mean, that's the best thing you can do for the comic book medium, is to do something that is just flat out funny and consistent and well drawn, and give the people what they want. And then the other choice is break new ground. Get out ahead, and every time you win a bet, I bet I can get them to sit still for a 500-page political novel. And instead of going, phew, I did that, time to turn him into a barbarian for the next 2 years, back into a barbarian for 2 years, you go, now I won that bet, so now I have to parlay that. Now I got to go 1,200-page religious novel, and let's see if I can make him sit still for that. There's as with all of these things, there's no control group. You can't say, okay, the comic book field would be this much further along if Dave Sim had just done, stuck with the crowd pleaser. Do 300 issues, but do the funniest 16-volume, crack 'em up, lots of yucks, big buffo, moments.
That probably would have died after 100 issues.
Yeah, it could very well have, but that might have been the best thing in terms of it dies after 100 issues, but it inspires all of these other guys to go, oh, I want to do that. And, we might have ended up with an environment where you don't have to put quotations around the comic when you talk about comic books. I mean, you look at most of them, and it's like, there's not a whole lot very comic about that, you know.
So do you,
Got a guy sitting here bleeding on the front cover, and, you know, his girlfriend's anguishing, and it's like, want to buy a comic book?
well, that's in that Masters of Comic Book Art. I think the first thing out of Will Eisner's mouth was comics are a misnomer. I think that was his first thing he said, because it really didn't make any sense. That's why he was always struggling to come up with another term for it. You know, for just that reason, there's nothing comic about it. So.
Well, we have a prayer time now, so we'll be back after this word from Mountain Dew.